Shalom. I want to give all praises, honor, and glory to Yahweh, Bahashem, Yahushai, Bahashem, Rakakodash. I want to give double honors to the apostles and elders of Great Millstone, because those are the men who I learned this truth from through spirit and power of Yahweh, Bahashem, Yahushai. Yahweh is the true name of the God of Israel. Yahushai is who the world ignorantly calls Jesus Christ, but his one and only true name is Yahushai. And pretty much this is going to be a video about Acts chapter 9 and verse 5, as well as Acts chapter 26 and verse 14, because we have to understand the scriptures in order to properly defend the gospel. All right. So a lot of times you read, little things, you can't just skip over it. First you get the understanding for the apostles and the leadership of Great Millstone. Then you do your research based off of what they already validated, and then you do videos on it. That's how you defend the gospel. You can't defend something that you can't break down. All right. So anyways, what inspired this video is because you got to understand we're all Israelites coming out of that Gentile state of mind, that pagan state of mind, that way of the world, which is the way of the heathen. So the same thing applies to Apostle Paul, but when he was known as Saul. When he was known as Apostle Paul, that was his conversion to accepting Yahushua. Then he understood grace and mercy and how guilty he was according to the law, even though he was a Pharisee that was persecuting the followers of Yahushua, which in the New Testament they was known as Christians. When you read Acts, the 6th and the 11th chapter, the Christians were Jews that followed the Messiah. The word Christian is not a term that's applied to just anybody. It was literally and physically Jews that followed the Messiah. So as Saul, before he accepted Yahushua, he was persecuting the Christians, which were Jews that followed the Messiah, because in his ignorance, he looked at it as idolatry, to see a Jew or any one of the 12 tribes of Israel worshiping and giving reverence to another power outside of the Most High Yahweh. All right. So in his ignorance, he got Stephen killed. He got a lot of Christians killed that's not even named. So let's go into this real quick. So now this is the book of Acts chapter 9 verse 5, but I'm gonna start at verse 1 to get like a quick backstory, because Apostle Paul is crucial to understanding that he was a prelude, along with Cornelius and other men that you read about in the scriptures, Yahushua eating with sinners and publicans. What did that represent? That represented that the Most High, through Yahushua's blood and sacrifice, was going to have mercy upon the uncircumcision, which is the Israelite foreigners, all right, aka the branches that was broken off, but they could be grafted back in because they originally was there in the first place. All right. So now this is Acts 9:1, and it's dealing with what? The conversion of Saul. You can also read about this in Acts chapter 22, verses 6 through 16, and Paul's trial before Agrippa in Acts chapter 26, verses 12 through 18. I'm just going to read this in the NLT, and then I'll switch back to the KJV. So Saul's conversion, Acts 9:1. Meanwhile, Saul was uttering threats with every breath and was eager to kill the Lord's followers, right? The Lord's followers, aka what? The Christians. That's when he was known as Saul. When he accepted Yahushua, he became known as Paul. It's just like when you come into the truth and brothers get a Hebrew name, once they accept the correct gospel and doctrine, and once they start to have faith and believe on Yahweh and Yahushua, you want to get your Hebrew name. It's the same, it's similar. Continuing on. Kill the Lord's followers, so he went to the high priest. So I'm going to just read this in the KJV. jumping back, Acts 9:1, it says, and Saul yet breathed out threatenings and slaughter against the disciples of the Lord. Right? So Paul, in his ignorance, he was zealous for the law because he was a Pharisee. Remember, the scriptures say in Acts 5 that he learned from Gamaliel. And Paul, ultimately, he was from a well-off family. The Pharisees back during this time, they were like middle class. The Sadducees, which pretty much would be like the high priests, will come out of the Sadducees. And remember, the Sadducees and the Pharisees, when you do your research, these were two groups of Jews that formed around the Greek Empire when you do your research. All right. Now, the Sadducees, they didn't believe in the afterlife. So obviously they wouldn't believe on the resurrection of Yahushua. The Pharisees, they believed in the afterlife, but both of them pretty much had the same mindset when it comes to the law. That if an Israelite is given reverence to any God outside of the Most High Yahweh, they would want to implement the law on you. They would judge you based off of the law. So that's why Paul was killing the Christians. So it says, Acts 9:1, and Saul yet breathing out threatenings and slaughter against the disciples of the Lord, went unto the high priest, and desired of him letters to Damascus, to the synagogues, that if he found any of this way, whether they were men or women, right, he might bring them bound unto Jerusalem. It says, and as he journeyed, he came near Damascus, and suddenly there shone round about him a light from heaven. And this was Yahushua. All right. Continuing on, it says, and he fell to the earth, right? Because he journeyed, so obviously he had to be around a horse during that time. He must have fell off his horse, right? And then this is what he saw. He's explaining it. And suddenly there shone around about, it says, there shone round about him a light from heaven, right? Obviously he had to be looking up at the sky to paint the visual. It says, and he fell to the earth and heard a voice saying unto him, Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me? Because if you persecuting the original Christians, which were Jews that followed the Messiah, and followers of Yahushua, right? You're persecuting Yahushua. That's how the Lord looks at that. Verse 5, it says, and he said, who art thou, Lord? And the Lord said, I am Yahushua, whom thou persecutest. Now, it don't mean that Paul was physically, persecuting Yahushua. It means that he was persecuting the original Christians that were Jews that followed the Messiah, that believed on the Messiah. They believed on Yahushua. So the fact that Paul was persecuting them, thinking that in his ignorance it was idolatry for what they were doing, that's why the Lord said what he said, that you're persecuting me, because you persecuting my believers that believe on me, right? So it says, and now here's the point. It says, why persecutest thou me? And he said, who art thou, Lord? And the Lord said, I am Yahushua, whom thou persecutest. It says, it is hard for thee to kick against the pricks. Now, this is what the lesson is based off of, right? Now, let's go here. So I went on Google and I typed in kick against the pricks, right? Kick against the pricks is an odium, meaning
futilely.
And that means futilely is an adverb, meaning to do something in a way that is pointless. That's what the Lord meant by kicking against the pricks. Ineffective or yields no useful result. It describes an action taken when there is little to no chance of success, kicking against the pricks. Because eventually you're going to have to fall in line. All right, so it says, resist authority, fate, or divine guidance, resulting in self-inflicted harm. It says, originating from an ancient agricultural metaphor, an ox resisting a pointed goad. The phrase highlights that fighting against a stronger power, this is what it means, kick against the pricks, right? It highlights that fighting against a stronger power on necessary, unchangeable circumstances only causes more pain to oneself. Key meaning and usage: to fight back uselessly against or to rebel against something stronger. It says biblical context, using Acts 9:5 and Acts 26:14, where it suggests resisting divine will causes pain to the resistor. It says usage, example 1, authority. By constantly complaining and breaking rules, he is just kicking against the pricks. He will only get himself fired, right? So Paul kicking against the pricks would be Yahawashi, and underneath Yahawashi, it would be the believers that's delivering the message of Yahawashi, which would be grace and mercy. All right, you having faith in order to be saved, not by the righteousness of the law. See, these are things that the Sadducees and Pharisees, they didn't want to hear that. It says, because they elevated Moses and the law ultimately and the prophets over Yahushua. That's why you had the transfiguration. The transfiguration was meant for what? That Yahushua is above the law and the prophets. So it says usage, example 2, fate/unchangeable situation. It is hard for you to kick against the pricks. You must accept that this company merger is inevitable, right? Now, how do you equate that to the scriptures? You got to accept that what? We under grace, and through Yahushua, we offer our spiritual sacrifices. We prove our faith. And there's a gospel and doctrine that got to make you wise unto salvation, all right? You're not made righteous by the keeping of the law. It says usage, example 3, self-harm. Continuing to complain about the inevitable is just kicking against the pricks, all right? Because ultimately, eventually, what will happen to Saul? He would have to be converted. So that's pretty much it. Synonyms or related phrases: fighting a losing battle, butting your head against a brick wall, kicking against the goads, a modern translation of pricks, banging your head against a wall, resisting the inevitable. It says the phrase is often associated with the story of Saul, later Paul, on the road to Damascus, who was told by Yahushua that his persecution of Christians, which are Jews that follow the Messiah, was a futile and self-destructive act. That's what that really means, all right? So now, let's read this. So this is Acts 26 and 14, but let's kind of start up a little bit. Because this is Paul's defense before Agrippa, because he's on trial, right? So you can read the backstory of how Paul pretty much, he's explaining his conversion, right? And how he became a Christian. But let's read this though, Acts 26 and 12. Whereupon, as I went to Damascus with authority and commission from the chief priest, at midday, O king, I saw in the way a light from heaven, which is Yahushua, above the brightness of the sun. So, you know, Yahushua, being that angelic state, he was brighter than the sun, above the brightness of the sun, shining round about me and them which journey with me. And when we were all fallen to the earth, I heard a voice speaking unto me and saying in the Hebrew tongue, right? Paleo-Hebrew, that's the language of the heavens. It says, Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me, right? And I already explained that. You persecuting the Christians, that's like persecuting the Lord, because those are his followers, right? It is hard for thee to kick against the pricks. And then it says, and I said, who art thou, Lord? And he said, I am Yahushua, whom thou persecutest. So now, let's deal with that. So I went on Google once again, and I typed in Acts 26:14 pricks. And this is what popped up, right? A overview, it says in Acts 26 and 14, Yahushua tells Saul, later Paul, on the road to Damascus, it is hard for thee to kick against the pricks, meaning it is a futile and self-destructive to resist divine authority. The pricks, or golds, were sharp sticks used to drive oxen who hurt themselves more by resisting. All right. Key aspects of the phrase. Context. Saul was actively persecuting Christians when he saw a bright light and heard Yahushua speaking in Hebrew. He wasn't speaking in Aramaic. Aramaic is a language we pretty much started speaking when we was in the Babylonian captivity. All right, 586 BC, when the Babylonians, you know, like around that time when they was in rulership. All right, a little bit before that. So certain translations is gonna say the Lord, you know, he was speaking in the Aramaic tongue, but Aramaic and Paleo Hebrew is two different languages. All right, it's similar. Like the Syrian Hebrew is similar, but it's not Paleo Hebrew. It's not that Phoenician Hebrew. All right, he was speaking to him in the Paleo Hebrew. He was in his angelic state. They don't speak Aramaic up there. It says meaning. The phrase was an ancient proverb. It signified that fighting against the conviction of the Holy Spirit and Yahweh's plan is pointless and causes self-inflicted pain. Yeah, because it's predestination. You can't fight against something that the Most High foreordained, that he predestinated. You got to live through it. It says modern translations. Many modern Bibles translate pricks as golds, referring to the metal-tipped sticks used by farmers. And as it said up here, that was used to what? To keep an oxen in line, to pretty much train them, right? It says the pricks or golds were sharp sticks used to drive oxen who hurt themselves more by resisting. So that's why the Lord was saying that. He's saying, why are you going against my authority? Why are you persecuting the believers that's coming with my message? Why are you resisting? So now let's go down here. It says symbolism. It highlights the transition of Saul from a stubborn persecutor, right, being a Pharisee, to a surrendered apostle, right? Now he understands that he's a sinner. He understands that what he was doing was wrong, persecuting the church, getting Stephen killed. But he did that in his ignorance. All right, he thought it was idolatry what they was doing. So him being an Israelite, even though he's guilty according to the law now, he could be forgiven through the blood and sacrifice of Yahushua, which grants a believer grace. So that's when he became Apostle Paul, all right, after his conversion. So it goes on to say, realizing his resistance was harmful. That's what it means, to kick against the pricks. It says in this passage, Yahushua highlights that Saul's zeal for his former mission was actually a direct rebellion against the Most High. This is also what it means, resulting in his own spiritual harm. All right? So that's pretty much it. Lord willing, you was edified by the lesson. Shalom.